Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to The Floating Head. Wonderful that you could join me for another Sunday evening on SimonTV. We are going out live tonight on X, YouTube, Instagram, Substack, Rumble, the Fediverse, and Resonate Radio in Finland. Wherever you are watching, please do like and share this broadcast so that everyone knows that we are here doing this. It very much does help with the algorithm. What a week it's been. Lots has been going on. Sean Plunkett has been taken to task by the Broadcasting Standards Authority. Zelensky didn't get his Tomahawk missiles. The far left and Antifa are rioting in Sydney right now and have been rioting overnight across the United States. There's a whole lot going on and many, many things for us to talk about, but we will be getting to that a little bit later. Before then, I have a fantastic guest joining me this evening. Dr. Oliver Hartwich is an extremely accomplished academic. He has a background in administration and economics, higher degrees from some of the most prestigious universities in the world, and has worked in the policy space across the Western Hemisphere for some of the most prestigious organizations working on public policy. He joins me now. Good evening, Dr. Hartwich. What a pleasure it is to see you.
Good evening. Great to be with you, Simon.
Fantastic. Well, can you tell us a little bit about yourself for those of us in the audience who don't know you, don't know the New Zealand Initiative? If you could give us a bit of background, that would be really helpful.
Okay, so I'm the executive director of the New Zealand Initiative think tank in Wellington. I've been in that position now for 13 and a half years, and prior to that, I worked in Sydney for the Centre for Independent Studies. Before that, at the Policy Exchange in London, where I was chief economist. Briefly, I was a research assistant in the House of Lords. But originally, as you mentioned, I am from Germany. I studied business administration and economics first, and then I did my PhD in law, and I did that between the universities of Bochum, Bonn, and Sydney. And that's me.
Well, it really is fantastic, and it always is. I always feel very gratified as a New Zealander when we get people from overseas who choose to live in New Zealand, become New Zealanders, and contribute to our society who are accomplished in life, because it really does tend to be the case that the traffic heads in the other direction. It doesn't seem to matter which field of human endeavor. It's the case that our best and brightest tend to go overseas, and it's nice to see some coming back the other way. Now, turning to the New Zealand initiative, it really does. I think of it as being kind of a New Zealand equivalent to the Policy Exchange. Would that in the United Kingdom? Would that be a fair assessment?
Yes, I mean, we're a think tank. We are also a business-funded think tank. In that regard, we are a bit different from most other think tanks worldwide because we have a strong business membership, currently about 110 members roughly, and they support our work. They support our work as a think tank, so they don't expect us to lobby for them. That's Business New Zealand or the Bankers Association. We don't do that. What we do instead is actually we work on the issues that we believe are really important for the long-term prosperity of this country. So we are working on education policy, on housing, on transport, on welfare, on practically everything that we believe is important for the future of this country. And in that regard, we are like most other think tanks in Australia or in Britain or in the US. So we do policy work, we write big reports, we write short research notes. We have a presence in the media. We write columns for the Herald, for Stuff, for the Australian. And so, we are doing pretty conventional standard think tank work. The only problem is, of course, in New Zealand, we don't really have that many think tanks. We are pretty much on our own.
You very much are, but I am going to talk about some of the competition a little bit further down the track. But what I think is just fantastic. Oh, also for the audience, you may recall that a few months back, I did have a conversation with Dr. James Kierstead, who is one of Dr. Hartwich's colleagues at the New Zealand Institute, and New Zealand Initiative, and it really tuned me on to the fantastic material that is produced by this organization. And I just absolutely love it. I read some of the columns, I read some of the research papers, And what I love about it, also I watch the podcast. What I love about it is just how thorough and how concise it is. But it isn't, I don't want to give the impression that it is completely dry and academic. I think that, it really is material that is fascinating, and it is something that all New Zealanders, if they're interested in a particular area of public policy, ought to familiarise themselves, because it really does inform the conversations. Would that be a fair assessment in your view?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, what we're trying to do is, every now and then we do original research, but a lot of our work is translating existing research into stuff that ordinary people, especially politicians, can understand. And so we have a task really to translate. Because let's face it, I mean, most economists write for other economists, and it's the kind of stuff, the kind of jargon that people outside academia probably wouldn't actually want to read. So that's our role, to make complicated stuff intelligible to ordinary folk, people who don't have an economics degree. And by the way, I think people should care about economics, because the stuff we're dealing with is really important. And so we're trying to make sure that everybody's got a chance to understand it and participate in these debates. But the other thing, you mentioned that you like reading our stuff. We are also trying to present stuff in a slightly different way, sometimes a quirky way. My favorite part, actually, every Friday is our number 3 column in our newsletter, which is always a piece of satire, and I love writing them.
Okay, fantastic. I haven't caught those yet. All right. I think I haven't subscribed to the newsletter. I'll need to do that. All right.
Oh, you should, by the way. Everybody should, of course. You can do that easily at nzinitiative.org.nz. Just put yourself in there and you'll get our newsletter every Friday, including that piece of satire.
All right, I'm going to sign up for it. Guys, Dr. Hartwich can't see what I've got on the screen, which is some of the reports that have been produced by the New Zealand Initiative over the last little while. And these are free to read, and I strongly recommend that you go and have a look at them. There's some really fascinating stuff in here. Owning less to achieve more. I want to talk about that because I attended the webinar in a moment. Building nations, what Canada's First Nations can teach us about devolution and development, which I thought was really, really fascinating. Monetary policy, unscrambling government, all of these things are really, really fascinating subjects, and I absolutely love reading them. Now, I think it's fair to say that, when you're involved in informing the conversations and you're looking to produce material which informs those sorts of discussions, you're dealing with very, very busy people. You're also dealing with politicians who are hearing numerous other perspectives. One of the questions that I have for you is, how much do you think it is the case that think tanks in general are doing work that ministers really ought to be expecting from their own in-house civil servants?
Very good question. And, once upon a time, of course, in-house public servants would have actually delivered the kind of thinking that think tanks deliver. And they wouldn't have been alone. I mean, once upon a time, you would have also had academics at universities doing that kind of policy-relevant research. You might have even occasionally had a journalist contributing longer think pieces. But the thing is, of course, times have changed. If you're in academia these days, you basically write to get your academic brownie points. You want to get published in prestigious journals, and you don't really care too much whether you're writing for the general public. You don't care whether you're writing for politicians. All you have to do is you have to publish in these big prestigious journals, because otherwise you won't actually climb the career ladder at academia. And similarly speaking, in journalism, you wouldn't have time to think anymore these days. Journalism is under such financial pressure that, the average journalist probably has to churn out 3, 4, 5 pieces a day and then produce a video and a podcast. So they wouldn't have the time to really deliver the big ideas that actually drive policy thinking forward. And so, in a way, all of these pressures have left a vacuum that's being filled by organizations like ours, where we actually have the time and the resources to deliver longer pieces, longer think pieces, do research, actually sit back and really have the luxury of thinking about a topic for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months. And that's what we do. And so I think we really fill that gap left in the market by all the other professions that once upon a time contributed in a similar way, but never do anymore.
Right, but that's fantastic, and it's just so wonderful that there is such a thing and that we can rely upon it. And certainly, looking at the policy exchange in the United Kingdom, I was living in the United Kingdom when it was being established, and I recall all of that happening. And it seemed to me that a large part of the motivation for it was, okay, look, for particularly for the Conservative Party, that some of the people in and around the Conservative Party who set it up, a part of their motivation was, look, we've got to move on a little bit from Thatcherism into, being a little bit more, how would you say, even-handed when it comes to policy, and looking a little bit more to put Margaret Thatcher behind us, which I think is really funny, because this is now a current a topic of conversation in the Conservative Party in 2025 as they're facing electoral devastation.
Yeah, I probably would put it a little bit differently. I mean, I'm a huge fan of Margaret Thatcher's, and I think she really rescued Britain. However, you're right about the role of think tanks in Margaret Thatcher. So when I moved to London in 2004, I often attended events at the Institute of Economic Affairs, which was, of course, Margaret Thatcher's think tank, the think tank that developed a lot of the policies of the Thatcher Revolution. The problem was that Institute of Economic Affairs was so dominant during the Thatcher years that once Thatcher left office, they found it really hard to adapt to the new realities. And so even 20 years on, or at the time not quite 20 years on, at the time 14 years on, you would still have events at the IEA basically celebrating Margaret Thatcher, her revolution, some of her policies. Every second publication, at least it felt like that, was my fondest recollections of Maggie. And so
Yes.
they were living in that past because it was such a glorious past for them. It also meant, of course, that they focused on just a narrow set of issues that were relevant to people from that kind of background. So a lot of it was, of course, on tax and spend, always important. A lot of it was on Europe because, Margaret Thatcher had her problems with Europe. And so between tax and spend and Brussels bashing, that was pretty much what the think tanks on that side of politics delivered. And so there was a bit of a vacuum on the right of politics for other ideas because, there were left-wing think tanks working on housing or education or health or local government or transport, but the right, they only talked about their favorite topics. And so out of that vacuum came a new generation of think tanks, and Policy Exchange was one of them. Another one was called Reform. And so they try to now talk about all of these issues that think tanks like the Adam Smith Institute and the Institute of Economic Affairs had kind of neglected a little bit. And so out of that came Policy Exchange. And when I joined the think tank was only about 2.5 years old, we worked a lot on education and on policing and on local government and on housing policy and urban regeneration. So we basically try to cover all of the stuff that was basically left untouched by the likes of the Institute of Economic Affairs.
Yeah, and I was really gratified to see that that kind of work continuing here this week with the wonderful paper that was presented and introduced by Sir Bill English this week on housing policy, Housing New Zealand and Kāinga Ora. I thought that was really fantastic. And the big takeaway from me is, look, here we have this organization which had something like, from memory, it was 2.5 billion in debt in 2017, which is now ballooned to I think 16 billion or somewhere thereabouts. And there were a couple of points about that. One was that this isn't necessarily solving social issues. Who actually owns the homes is less significant than the social consequences, the social improvements that you get from having some sort of housing assistance. But the second thing is, and that I'd really like to explore with you, is how it's investment in assets that might be used better in other forms of assets. What was your perception of that paper and how it was received?
Well, maybe we start with how the paper was actually started. It came out of a conversation we had with Bill English in our office, probably in late February or early March this year. So Bill visited us in the office and we had a chat over a glass of wine. with Bryce Wilkinson. And Bill, of course, had previously undertaken the independent review of Kaingaora. When the government was first formed, they set up this independent review, and he reported about half a year later. And Bill told us that he thought there was still a lot more work to be done. I mean, apart from the official report that he delivered. And so he strongly encouraged us to look more deeply into the finances of that organization and ask actually, what does it contribute? And do we actually need to have an organization like that, or could we deliver this in a more private market way? The other issue that Sir Bill mentioned repeatedly actually was that Kaingaora is also the biggest land banker in the country. So if you really want to fix, for example, our supermarket business and want to release a bit more land for development of new supermarkets, typically that land in the inner cities is actually held by Kaingaora. So he said he would have to start there. And so that was the initial motivation for doing that research. And then Bryce Wilkinson basically took that idea and wrote a whole report, then ran it past Bill, of course, because we wanted to get his input and feedback since he had done the independent review. And he liked the report, he wrote the foreword to it. And then, of course, as you mentioned, he spoke in the webinar this week. So that was really the genesis of this paper. Now, as you said before, this is not about asking whether we should help people who really need help. It's just, how do we help them? Because do we actually need to own the assets? And some of the assets are, we would think, quite poorly managed. Or would it be better actually to pay direct income transfers so people can actually afford the house that they need and actually get that house rented on the private market? Because what we also found was that actually the subsidy now for Kaingaora homes on average is about $29,000 a year. So it's a substantial amount of money. And you would probably imagine that it gets you a little bit more on the private market.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing that, and this is just another case. When you look at the statistics of it, the return on investment is just not there. It's a return that one ought to expect that the private sector can generate a lot better than the public sector. But this brings me on to a tremendous piece that you personally wrote that I'll bring up on screen. New Zealand's answer to infrastructure crisis hiding in plain sight. And this, guys, this is on Dr. Hartwich's personal blog, oliverhartwich.com. This was really, really fascinating. And it was talking about where we're investing and how we're investing it. And this bit really struck me. It was where you wrote this: the Infrastructure Commission estimates it to be around NZ 104 billion, with a further shortfall of 106 billion over the next 30 years. Willis cannot borrow more without exacerbating the fiscal position. She cannot raise taxes without killing what little growth remains, and she cannot want to preside over infrastructure that is in desperate need of an upgrade. Australian politicians will be familiar with the problem. In fact, they solved it more than a decade ago through asset recycling, selling or leasing government-owned commercial assets and reinvesting the proceeds in new infrastructure. It delivered results, and it is precisely the scheme New Zealand should learn from. I thought that just seemed, I'm not an economist, but that just seemed really, really sensible to me, Dr. Hartwich.
Yeah, thank you. I thought so too, actually. I mean, no, I mean, I couldn't have put it better myself. In fact, I wrote it. And you're right, by the way. You can find this on my website, but it was actually written for the Australian newspaper. It was my column. And also, this week, actually, I had a debate at a large conference, the Infants Conference, with Julie Angenta and others on asset recycling. Which we won, by the way. So anyway, the idea there is that we know we have got big infrastructure needs. And we also know, of course, that public finances are really tight. So the Minister of Finance will really struggle to deliver any of that we all think we need, like new hospitals and upgrades to our transport network and so on. And so the question is actually, where do we get the money from? And the idea here is to use some of the assets the government currently has on its balance sheet. And by the way, we did another report some time ago where we estimated that currently the Crown has a balance sheet of about $571 billion of assets. Not all of them are core government business. I mean, the government, for example, through NZ Post, has a courier company. I'm not sure whether government actually needs to run courier companies. It holds 51% in a few gentailers, electricity companies. Again, you could ask yourself, is that government's proper function? And I would say probably not. And then, of course, it also has a share, quite a substantial share in Air New Zealand. And so you could actually think about, can't we just sell some of these assets, ring fence the money, and then take it to invest in actual core government business? And I mean, a hospital, for example, or a new road is probably a bit closer to the government's core business than running a courier company, or Core Logic, the company that actually determines house prices. I mean, none of this stuff needs to be done by government-owned entities. And so this is the idea of asset recycling. It's basically just a reorganization of the government's balance sheet. This is not about the old style kind of privatization where the government just sells stuff and basically walks away. It's actually taking that money from those asset sales to recycle that into stuff the government should actually do. And so I think, some people like to characterize this as privatization and drag. For me, this is just better balance sheet management.
Well, and it certainly makes sense because, of course, it becomes a political issue. Privatization, particularly for the leftists in our media, in our academia, in our bureaucracy, is anathema. Anything where they say, look, selling assets off, they just think, okay, that's what's the term that they use? Socializing the cost and privatizing the benefits. And of course, that's not necessarily true. And I take your point about it being described as privatization in drag. That sounds like the sort of thing that a Julian Genter would use as a soundbite. But if, as you say, it is ring fence and it's like, okay, look, we are just reinvesting money from one part of the economy into something that's a little bit more like core business and is more useful, it just seems more sensible. The question I would have is, do we have the will, the political will from our current administration to actually make that case and get it over the line in the public mind?
I think we do, actually. If you talk to the Minister of Finance, she will tell you that she would love to do that because she knows exactly what her books look like. And she also knows what she would really like to invest in and where she doesn't have the money currently. So I think from the Minister of Finance's perspective, this is pretty logical, and I think she would be up for it. And you can see that in how she sold that debt that Chorus still owed the government. And she was very happy to do that because she could see what benefit I think it was $1.2 billion would actually have for her and her investment program. When it comes to the Prime Minister, I'm not so sure because the Prime Minister has been way more cautious about all of this. And all of Christopher Luxon's statements on asset recycling over this term have always been very cautious, very standoffish. Yeah, definitely not this term, maybe the second term, if we get a mandate, but potentially, perhaps, who knows. So I actually sense there is a bit of a rift between the PM and the Minister of Finance. But no, I think there are certainly people within the current government who would love to do this.
Well, that's fantastic. And you're right. I've been deeply critical of Christopher Luxon. However, in my opinion, the best thing that can be said about him is that his style is non-controversial and managerial. But it is good to hear that there is within the National Party caucus at least some enthusiasm for actually addressing some of these issues. I did want to come back to the New Zealand initiative because I really like the way that the organisation is described, which I've got up on screen now. And this, guys, this is for the audience. I'm going to read you a bit about it because I thought this as a mission statement was really, as a Kiwi, I was really well heartened by this. It reads this: Welcome to the New Zealand Initiative. There are fantastic opportunities for New Zealand today with our young and well-educated population and being geographically positioned in the middle of the fast-growing Pacific region. New Zealand can be one of the rising stars of the 21st century. This is what the New Zealand Initiative is all about. We are the organisation to sketch pathways towards a better future. Our mission is to help create a competitive, open and dynamic economy and a free, prosperous, fair and cohesive society. As New Zealand's leading think tank, we work closely with our members, policymakers across the political spectrum, the wider business community, the media, academics and the general public. Now, why this actually gives me some heart is because we are, over the last few years, I think the vast majority of New Zealanders have lost a lot of hope. We remember a decade ago being described, probably a little bit charitably, as a rock star economy. How it was the case that New Zealand was moving away from being primary industry and tourism, looking to actually ensuring that there was value add of raw materials happening in New Zealand and so on. We remember that. But now it seems that we've had 6 years of the Ardern regime, which devastated our economy, increased social divisions terribly. And it's been followed by an administration which charitably has not been the antidote to some of those policies that many New Zealanders would like. So do you believe, Dr. Hartwich, that there is cause for optimism, that New Zealand might have a bright future and people like me are just being overly pessimistic?
Well, I should probably explain that mission statement was, of course, written during those rockstar economy years. Except we never changed it because I still believe it's true. This is a country with enormous potential. We are still a relatively young population. I mean, we're an aging population like every other population, but we're starting from a much younger age than many European countries are already today. We are also, by and large, still a relatively well-educated population, even though we've now had problems in our education system for a while. But still, by international standards, I mean, we can compete. And yes, we are in the middle of a quite dynamic region, definitely a growth region. We are not a Europe, which is stagnating, but we're actually closer to some of the most exciting countries on the planet. So yes, we've got a lot of things going for us. And it's a country with friendly people, with a moderate climate in a decent time zone, because you can actually do business with the US relatively easily from New Zealand. So we've got plenty of opportunities here, except we are very poor at actually realizing all of these chances. So one example, I mean, this is a country of just, what is it now, 5.5 million people, geographically the size of the UK or Italy. We should have abundant, affordable housing. And of course, we don't, because we have ridiculously limited and rationed land. And therefore, we have increased house prices to a level that you would expect in a highly densely populated country. But there is no reason why we need to be like that. And actually, we can change this. We can be a country where housing is plentiful and affordable. So we can do that. So there are ways in which we can actually use all of these advantages we have to our advantage and actually create one of the most prosperous countries in the world. But we have to get the right policies to do that and the right attitude.
Yes, and I think attitude, an attitude extends beyond the decision makers. It encompasses all of us, and I think that it'd be good if we had some political leaders who could inspire the general population and sell a vision, which is like, look, this is where we're going, this is where we are going, and this is how we're going to improve things. But I did want to make mention of another think tank here, and that is the Helen Clark Foundation. And for those guys, I'm going to bring, for people who don't know, the Helen Clark Foundation is it's kind of it really is quite a contrast. I don't know if you guys have ever read their material, but the contrast could not be greater. It's a very, very poorly researched publications that are very, very emotive, and they talk about sort of, broad strokes issues, and there's very little that actually accounts for anything that you would consider things like empirical evidence. And here's some of the articles that they've recently written: age proofing Aotearoa, social cohesion in New Zealand, junk food and poor policy, and improving transparency in New Zealand's political and governance systems, written by an organization involving Helen Clark. And what I'm really concerned about, Dr. Hartwich, is this, that when it comes to the decision makers, what happens is that they've got, like, you have a minister, for example, and they're sitting and they're seeing, they've got a bunch of civil servants in Wellington, staring at them. Wearing a lot of corduroy, and some of them have rainbow-colored hair, and they are being presented with a plurality of perspective. So you have the civil service perspective, you have an analysis from the New Zealand initiative, and then you have a report from, for example, an organisation like the Helen Clark Foundation. And I just wonder how much an organization like that counterbalances. And this is, I know this is quite a long-winded explanation, but the reason I'm asking this is, by trade, I'm an enterprise architect. Now, in my field, what I'm expected to do is to apply logic, reason, and critical thinking to solve business problems and present that very, very methodically and using evidentiary methodologies. So what happens is I go and it's very, very formulaic. I have to look at problems, look at all of the options for it, and really, really section it down into, these are the requirements, these are the risks, these are the objectives, etc. All of that sort of stuff, right? And then present that to the corporations, to the corporates that I work for, so that the decision makers, typically at C-level, can make a decision about the evidence. All right. Now, the thing is, for me to go and do this sort of stuff is very, very similar to the kind of investigative papers that you produce. Probably for my sorts of work like that, it might be, I don't know, sometimes it's a month, sometimes it's 3 months, kind of a research project. Just for fun, once upon a time, I was at the presentation meeting for one of these types of papers, and I'd noticed in the past that no one, when we were attending these meetings, they would listen to me speak, but they would never open them. So what I did for this one report, which was for a very large company here in New Zealand, was I printed off 10 copies of the report, 10 of just the first page, and stapled it to 10 blank pages to see if anyone would notice, and no one did. Right? Now, a couple of things about that. Firstly, okay, look, they trust me. They trust that when I'm saying, look, that I've done the research, I'm presenting it, you don't really need to read it. You can just trust that the fat guy has got the evidence if we need to go and reference it, right? But what I'm really concerned about, and this is my question for you, I know it's taken me a long time to get here, is how often is it the case that you've got a minister sitting there and he's got a nonsense report from something like the Helen Clark Foundation on one hand, and he's got very, very thorough work from the New Zealand initiative on the other, and there is no actual comparison of the quality of the research that has gone into that?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for your kind words on our quality. I mean, we pay a lot of attention to quality, and I always think we need to produce reports that stack up to academic standards and scrutiny. So the kind of stuff that you could otherwise publish in an academic journal, except not in the style of an academic journal, written in a more accessible way so that ordinary folk can understand it. That's the idea, but our stuff should definitely stack up academically, and we give our papers in draft form to peers for review. We get them fact-checked, we get them properly edited, sub-edited, so that they actually ideally do not contain any errors and are easy to digest. What other organizations do, I can't really comment on. I mean, I may not always agree with the Helen Clark Foundation, of course, but I think it's great that they are there, because I think we need more think tanks, left, right, and center. I mean, when I worked in London, there were probably around 25, 30 think tanks, but all over the political spectrum, from the Fabian Society to the Adam Smith Institute and everything in between. And that's great, because you need to have the battle of ideas, because even your own side of policy or politics may not always get everything right. So it's good to have people actually telling you when you're wrong. It's good to have that contest of ideas. We don't have that in New Zealand. And that's why, in principle, I think it's great to have more think tanks also on the left, people I don't agree with, because I think that makes for a more interesting debate. When it comes then to the quality of these publications, well, I don't want to comment on what our colleagues in other think tanks do. I would only say from our perspective, if you produce good quality and you do that consistently and people can rely on your publications, you build a reputation. And then people will open your reports. It might be on a different field that we've never dealt with before, or they never read from us before, and they will take it seriously from the first report because we've got that reputation. If you deliver shallower reports, not that well referenced reports, poorly written reports, again, that builds a reputation in a different kind of way. And by the way, I would also say it's very hard to build a decent reputation, such as the one that I think we have now. It is very easy to lose it with just a single shoddy, poor report. So you have to be really careful with the stuff that you put out. And that would be my advice to any kind of think tank. I'm not looking at the Alan Clark Foundation. I'm just speaking in general terms, because I've worked in think tanks now for 20 years, and I've seen what happens to think tanks when they get things wrong. It's pretty nasty. It can be pretty traumatic for the organization. So you might actually invest, decades into building a brand and a name for yourself, and then you put out one really shoddily put together paper, and basically you wreck your reputation in a few moments. So you have to be careful with that.
All right. Well, I'm gratified to learn that that the world still works like that, at least in the field of public policy and think tanks, because increasingly the contest of ideas doesn't really exist in the bazaar of public interaction. Instead, what we're seeing is that there isn't any contest of ideas. What there is tribalism and just acceptance of a perspective, regardless of whether or not it is right or wrong. It's just like, okay, well, this is my tribe. I back them, and everyone in my echo chamber says that is right. So I don't ever need to engage that critical thinking, the critical thinking skills that the sort of the Enlightenment principles approach to logic and reason that most people were brought up to engage in when they were problem solving. We're not seeing that anymore. And there was another article which I think really exemplified this. And Dr. Hartwich, I have up on screen the piece that you wrote, Transparency versus Conspiracy. And this really, to me, epitomized it. And I just wanted to read the audience a little bit of it. A young TikTok activist has discovered something shocking about New Zealand policymaking. Brace yourself. A leading New Zealand think tank recommended a knowledge-rich curriculum for schools, and the government agreed. Apparently, this is a scandal. Not the declining literacy rates, not the children struggling to read. No, the scandal is that a think tank suggested structured literacy and politicians listened. Racing breathlessly through connections and implications, the young activist presents the revelation as if she had uncovered Watergate 2.0. Thousands of views and shares suggested people find this compelling. What she never explains, however, is why teaching children to read through phonics might be bad, but then that would require evaluating the actual policy. As it happens, I run this particular think tank, the New Zealand Initiative, and perhaps I should feel flattered that we are considered puppet masters of such Machiavellian cunning that we have convinced the government to teach children how to decode words. Truly, our dark powers know no bounds. Next, we will suggest children learn multiplications tables. I am not flattered, though. Instead, I am worried. Not about criticism, because that comes with the territory. What worries me is that we seem to have forgotten how democracy actually works. Are wise words, Dr. Hartwich, and we see this all of the time. I see this from really prominent thinkers, quote unquote, that are prominent, that a lot of people read. A good example is there's this chap, Martin Bradbury, who will often use thought-stopping techniques on a left-wing blog, which is very, very popular amongst politicians and Greens and the Labour. He's effectively their Nostradamus, and he will use thought-stopping techniques and say, the New Zealand Initiative is getting dark money from the Atlas network or something like that, and that is used to dismiss any argument whatsoever, because this seems to me to be the zeitgeist of our times.
Yes, and I totally agree with you on Martin Bradbury, who has become a little bit unhinged recently, I would say. Um, I'm also thinking, of course, of that TikTok activist that you just mentioned. I mean, she doesn't just post on TikTok, she also is very active on Facebook. I actually saw that again last night. She posted another really ridiculous piece about education policy, mentioned us, and I still don't quite understand what our crime is. So the crime is apparently that we are now trying to teach young New Zealanders to read and do mathematics and so on. I don't quite understand what the conspiracy theory is that business actually pays attention to that. But anyway, okay, fine. She then discovered that the New Zealand Initiative has a 25% shareholder, and that's Chris Quinn, the CEO of Foodstuffs. And so she says basically that Foodstuffs is now running education policy in this country. You know, there's always a kernel of truth. I mean, Chris Quinn does have one share of 4 of the New Zealand Initiative, but he basically holds it in trust. It's not as if Foodstuffs is invested, and I mean, we're not for profit, and we are not delivering our profits to Foodstuffs, and Foodstuffs doesn't tell us what to do. But anyway, this is the kind of stuff, the kind of engagement in inverted commas that you get on Facebook. And what makes it so annoying, really, when I read posts like that, I mean, this activist is indeed very active. And her videos often have 100,000 views on Facebook, which is a lot for a small country like New Zealand. And nevertheless, I mean, she doesn't do her homework. She doesn't do proper research. She refuses to talk to us and be corrected. I mean, that is a problem because that is a really dangerous kind of debate where you only really try to figure out where ideas come from rather than asking yourself, well, is it a good idea or not? She never debates these ideas. It's a funny thing. She only asks where they're from. So there I do have a
Indeed.
problem. As I said, I don't have a problem with other think tanks disagreeing with us and contributing their own ideas to the debate. But when it comes to activists like that, really just basically shouting from the sidelines without having done any research and no proper argument, and actually never listening to the other side and never actually engaging in serious kind of policy discussions, and I find that really quite disheartening and actually quite scary because, I mean, what does it tell us about a society if, pardon my French, crap like that can get 100,000 views? I
Yeah,
mean,
well, you're right. And
as I said,
it's
I don't have a problem discussing stuff with people who disagree with us, provided we have a proper intellectual debate and they bring their evidence and I bring ours, and then we really bash it out and discuss. That's fine. But all of these unsubstantiated allegations and then this dark money influencing our policies and probably foodstuffs now wants our children to learn how to read and write, it's just nonsense. I think we can be better than that.
I think we can, but we are living in a post-truth world, and this is the power of the demagogue in an era of identity politics, where this person is completely uninformed, is emotive, is just irrational in their approach. However, that gains traction. And it's simply because the Enlightenment principles that we were all brought up, the contest of ideas, logic, reason, critical thinking, debate, these sorts of things, that is no longer in fashion. What is in fashion is that these demagogues on Twitter who can create these ignorant conspiracy theories, and that is what gains currency in the world. But but there is, there's 2 types of audiences, right? Like, often it's been said to me as someone who's a streamer is like, well, there's a real difference in your audience between the numbers that you're getting of the people that are watching, which is always great, but also the types of people that are watching, right? And the good thing is, when it comes right down to it, with someone like that, or in point of fact, probably someone like me, it's very, very few decision makers, serious people are actually involved in consuming that content, with the obvious exception of Julianne Genter.
Yeah, well, I can tell you when we are running our webinars, we typically get a few hundred viewers, but I can see who's on the call, and we've got plenty of decision makers. So sometimes it's that quality that counts. But still, for a broader democratic discourse, having these 100,000 poorly informed people shouting at each other and shouting at us, that can't be very healthy for democracy long run.
I certainly agree, and the Greeks showed us that 2,000 years ago, and that is really one of the reasons why I was just so very pleased that you accepted my invitation to come on to Simon TV, because I have a whole bunch of people I'm sure in the audience that may not be aware of the New Zealand initiative, but I'm hoping that we can spark some interest, because I just absolutely love your material, and I really don't feel informed on a topic unless I've gained your perspective on it, and I'm hopeful that we can sort of get that sort of broader view. With that in mind, like I had a fantastic discussion with your colleague, Dr. Kierstead, and one of the problems, of course, because it's challenging for me. My essential challenge in life is that I truly am as stupid as I look. So it's quite difficult to know how to elicit the right information from people who are so much smarter than me. But moving on to the next topic, I wanted to change a little bit and get your perspective while I've got you on European affairs, because for us here in the South Pacific, Europe it seems to be an increasingly foreign land. Where I get a lot of one of the podcasts that I really enjoy watching is Alexander Makuris, who podcasts for the Duran, who often provides a very fascinating insight into European affairs. And I read one of your pieces recently about the financial challenges that are that the museum that is France is facing. But following that, there was a really interesting piece from Alexander Makuris about the massive drop off of German industry, and the term that he used was not German industry is facing challenges. He was saying we are looking at industrial collapse, and he used the example of steel prices. Can you give us a bit of a perspective on what is actually happening economically inside the European Union?
How much time do we have? Yes, I can. I mean, starting with Germany, I mean, that is entirely true. Germany is looking at industrial collapse. In fact, German manufacturing output is currently at levels last seen in 2005. So that tells you something. The problems are manifold. Where do we start? Germany had a business model where it basically got its economic power from exports to China, cheap energy imports from Russia, and security provided by the Americans. All of that has basically broken away, and pretty much simultaneously. Germany was a country that had massive export surpluses for a long time. That was always seen as the kind of safe haven within the Eurozone, so the destination of capital flight from other European countries. And it was also benefiting from a euro currency that was too weak for German export strength. And that actually enabled the Germans to export more. Had they kept the old Deutschmark, the Deutschmark would have long appreciated and would have actually brought this back under control. But of course, under the euro currency, Germany effectively got an exchange rate that was right for countries like France and Italy and Spain and Greece, of course. But it was too weak for German export strength. And so a lot of things have gone wrong for the German economy over the last 20, 30 years. On top of that, terrible policies, of course, from Angela Merkel, but also from her successor and from her predecessor. Germany hasn't had decent economic reforms for decades. I mean, the last economic reforms were undertaken by Gerhard Schröder in 2003. That's when he was liberalizing the German labor market. But apart from that, the German economy is pretty sclerotic and very bureaucratic. And as I said, the basic pillars upon which it rested have all broken away. And so that's why Germany is struggling. Why France is struggling, meanwhile, well, France last recorded a balanced budget, I believe it was in 1973. So this is a country that doesn't know how to balance a budget. Currently, it's sitting on a budget deficit of about 5.6% of GDP. Just as a reminder, the European treaties actually say that the maximum allowed is 3%. Well, then again, the European treaties also say that the maximum allowed level of debt is 60% of GDP, and France is at 110. So that's France. France needs to get its budget deficit in order. problem with France today is, of course, that the president has absolutely no political capital left. The parliament is divided in three blocks that hate each other. And they are now on to the, I believe, fourth prime minister in the last 12 months. So that's the problem for France. And just to get the prime minister, who just resigned a couple of weeks ago, of course, if you remember, back into office with another official task from the president to form a government, the first thing he had to do was he had to go to the socialist left and tell them, okay, in order to get your support in the National Assembly, let's just postpone the pensions reform, because, it's so nice when you can actually retire at 62, as they do in France. And so that's France's problem. And so you could basically go around Europe and you have a look at pretty much every single country, and you can find that actually they haven't done anything to improve their competitiveness for a long time. The euro currency hasn't helped. Brussels hasn't helped. The European Central Bank hasn't helped. And so Europe is in a bit of a pickle. And it has been for a long time. And here comes my interest in all of this. I mean, obviously, I come from Europe. I'm a German economist, so how could I not follow any of this? But more specifically, what happened to me was actually when I worked at Policy Exchange, I was not allowed to write about European affairs and European Union affairs, because that was such a toxic thing for a Conservative Party think tank. Once you start talking about Europe, all hell will break loose. That's what we thought. And you know what? It is true in 2016. So anyway, when I moved to Australia, I had this built-up kind of tension inside me where, for years I hadn't been able to write about this. And now I was in Australia and I thought, well, now I can. And so when the Euro crisis happened and I had just started my job in Australia, I penned a very angry column about the European Union's crisis management at the time and submitted it to an online publication called The Business Spectator. I'm not sure whether you remember, that was Alan Kohler's thing. And so it was just to vent my anger and to just let it all out, all the stuff that had built up over years. And to my absolute surprise, a day later, I got a phone call from Alan Kohler, and he said, that was a very good piece. Would you like to write this a bit more regularly? And I said to Alan, what do you have in mind? He says, how about a weekly column for as long as that Euro crisis lasts? Well, in the end, my column lasted 300 columns, and it only finished once the Business Spectator got bought by the Australian newspaper, and then all the columns ended. So by that time, I had written 300 pieces on Europe. I was kind of glad actually to leave that behind, because writing every week about the decline of Europe is quite tiring, and often at the time only was possible over a glass or two or a bottle of red wine. But anyway, so the column was finished, and then I was for a while actually quite relieved that I didn't have to chronicle all of this decline every week. But then after a couple of years of not writing this column, it kind of, I felt this itch again. And then I ran into Bernard Hickey from Newsroom. And I mentioned to Bernard that actually I kind of miss writing about all of this nonsense, except I wouldn't want to do this as a weekly column anymore. And Bernard said, well, you can do it fortnightly with us. Bingo, done. And so that was in 17 or 18. So now for the past 7 or 8 years, I've been writing fortnightly columns in Europe. And so by now I've probably written, I guess, in total 450 or so pieces about every aspect of Europe's decline. I even turned this into a little book a few years ago, which got a nice endorsement from John Howard, the former Australian Prime Minister. And it has the optimistic title, Why Europe Failed.
That sounds like the sort of thing Douglas Murray would come up with.
Yeah, so that's my Europe story.
Okay. Well, you're right. Just to come back to a couple of things that you said, the first thing that occurred to me was, like France effectively has not had a government for 12 months. And you talked about the pension issue. Can you imagine how difficult it is? You're the prime minister. You've resigned as prime minister of France. You've been reappointed again anyway. And then you have to go and talk to Jean-Luc Mélenchon about pension reform,
Mm-hmm.
like, that would just be absolutely difficult. But the other thing I wanted to talk to you about was strategically. You talked about how Germany had always been able to rely upon cheap energy from Russia. Now, strategically, that's gone away, but the perception in our part of the world is that Germany is now paying an awful lot for energy, and they've effectively replaced Russia as a supplier to a degree with the United States as a supplier. Would that be a fair?
Yeah, not just the United States, of course. I mean, they also managed to get some liquefied gas from the Middle East as well. So, I mean, they scrambled to get supplies in when Nord Stream 1 didn't deliver anymore. Nord Stream 2 was blown up. And so, no, the Germans certainly have to pay a lot more for energy these days. But at least their homes are still warm. They didn't have a cold winter. I mean, there was a fear, of course, in 22 that they might at some stage really run dry when it comes to the gas supply, and they would have a very unpleasant cold winter. That didn't happen, fortunately. But yeah, Germany certainly has a price to pay. By the way, I'm just listening to a new audiobook, which only got released, I believe, on Wednesday this week. Das Versagen, the failure. It's only available in German. If anyone here reads German, I can wholeheartedly recommend it. I'm halfway through the book now. It's about the failure of German foreign policy vis-a-vis Russia. Written by a former editor-in-chief of Spiegel magazine and one of his colleagues. And it's an absolutely fascinating story because it just condenses everything into, well, the audiobook is 12 hours long. The complete failure of the German elites in dealing with Russia after 1989, the complete naivete of dealing with the Russians, of actually falling for Putin's tricks, of being manipulated against other European and NATO allies. Fascinating story. As a German, you read this, and I mean, I was familiar with pretty much all of the topics actually in that book because I've written so many columns about this myself. But they have some new, just recently released documents, Secret Service information on what happened. It is absolutely fascinating. And you read this actually as a German and you feel embarrassed how a country can get its foreign policy so wrong.
All right. Well, I'll look forward to, I don't read German, so I'll look forward to reading an English translation. But another thing from this perspective of the Anglosphere, like it always used to be said for people of my generation who grew up watching Yes Minister and so on, was that what we really admired about Britain was being the voice of reason in the rabid American ear. That the Americans seemed to be, political. They just went around the world causing a great deal of difficulty for a whole bunch of countries, regime change here, war there, all that sort of stuff. And to a degree, you could rely upon Great Britain to be the voice of reason. With the Iraq War, the second Iraq War, and Tony Blair jumping in boots and all with the Americans, the world stopped relying upon Great Britain in that regard. They just became more of a poodle for American foreign policy. So a new hope, to quote Star Wars, was born, and that is that the European Union and the single currency would counterbalance to a degree the American dollar as the global reserve currency. But what we're seeing now, like I noticed that this seemed, as an economist, you'll know more about the significance of this than I ever will. But I saw that I think it's BHP did this massive mining deal in Australia last week, and they are actually listing or selling in the Chinese currency and setting up all of the financial mechanisms internationally and intranationally to support those sorts of financial transactions directly. So I'm really interested in your perspective, firstly, on how on the future of the Eurozone as the sort of the second global reserve currency, and secondly, how you see the sort of this fragmentation occurring between trading blocks around the world.
Okay. And maybe we start even with Britain, since you started with them. As a German Anglophile, I always looked across the channel, and I always blamed my ancestors for missing the last boats across the channel, because that's where I really want to be. If you're a German Anglophile, if you're a German classical liberal, you look across the channel and you think that's the promised land. That's the land where milk and honey flow, and that's where classical liberalism came from, and that's the home of Adam Smith and John Locke. And So as German classical liberals, we always look at Britain in kind of admiration. And so I moved to Britain and to work there, expecting this kind of promised land. And what I found was a country that was very much like Germany. It was um, I always joke that Britain and Germany were more similar than the Germans think and the British wish to believe. And maybe that's because they've got a common heritage in a way, and actually languages that are quite similar. And I mean, let's face it, the royal family is also German. So the two countries actually have more in common than first meets the eye. They're both, mixed economy welfare states, and they're both incredibly poorly governed and have been for a long time. So maybe that's just a starting point on Britain. But your real question was about something else. Your real question was about currencies. And so the great hope, of course, of the European project, the European monetary project, was that the euro one day would rival the US dollar and become the world's reserve currency. Well, that hasn't happened yet. So currently, the euro has about a share of 22% of global reserve currencies. The dollar is still dominant, not as dominant as it used to be. I mean, once upon a time, about 80% of the world's currency reserves were US dollar. I think that's gone down to the high 50s now. Last time I checked, I think it was 57% or something like that. Then comes the euro at 22%, and then we've got a few other currencies, plus Bitcoin, plus gold. So that's where we are roughly. The question is, where will this go? Will the euro at some stage now take over from the US dollar because of everything that Trump does? I mean, that's what President Macron said about 3-4 months ago. And I did write a column about that too. Or will we see something completely different? And I think we will see something completely different, because the euro still is not ready to take over from the dollar as a world lead currency. I mean, it's basically two sick currencies now. The US dollar is pretty sick because of American reckless spending and Trump's fiscal policy, plus, of course, his trade policy. So none of this really works for the US dollar as a reserve currency. And sometimes you might even wonder whether all of this stuff is deliberate, and a deliberate policy to weaken the US dollar and to basically wreck it as the world's lead currency. At least that's what Stephen Miran, Trump's chief economic advisor, of course, posted in November last year in a long paper. But in any case, the euro is not much better, because the euro was never a properly designed currency union. It always lacked a few basic elements that you need to make such a currency union successful. And so just because the US dollar is struggling does not mean that the euro can do any better. And so the question then becomes, what else could be the world's reserve currency? Could that be a mixture of different currencies? Could the Chinese play a role? I am actually quite skeptical about the Chinese playing that role, because, again, you need a few other prerequisites to be a world reserve currency. One of them is actually that you have deep capital markets, so that actually you can provide the kind of capital backing really for being a reserve currency, and the Chinese don't have that. But the other thing is, of course, you need that institutional safety and certainty. You need property rights. And again, if the world looks at China a bit more closely, they can see that that's not present there either. And so, okay, the US dollar probably won't cut it much longer. The euro still isn't ready, even after a quarter of a century, and the Chinese are not the kind of system where you would want to be invested in. So what does it mean? It means that in the end, we're talking about maybe in 10 or 20 years' time, we will not have a single world reserve currency as we used to have with the dollar, previously sterling, but we will have a bundle of different currencies all performing their own roles. And on top of that, what we also see then is that the world might indeed fracture. And we can see this fracturing not just in monetary terms, but really in trade terms. We see different blocs emerge. We see that the BRICS are now trying to rival the Western architecture. So they're starting their own ratings agencies. They're starting their own clearing mechanisms. They're moving away from, for example, the SWIFT system that we have in Western international finance. And so they are starting their own parallel infrastructure. And it is very well conceivable that in the end, we will also have, a currency to go with that kind of infrastructure. But that's probably where we are going to be headed. It's not going to be a unipolar world anymore. It's It's going to be a multipolar world with multiple currencies.
All right, and to bring it back to New Zealand, because as a small economy, a leaf on the wind of international affairs, how do we navigate this sort of turbulence in world affairs successfully?
Well, I think what we desperately have to do is we have to find countries that are very much like us, that share our values, that we can trust, that are also democracies, and we have to cooperate with them, by the way, not just on trade, not just on the economy, but really in defense terms as well. And obviously, the first country that we should get closer to is Australia, because we are already quite integrated in a number of ways, but I think we should deepen that relationship. We have, and we've had for a long time now, one of the world's leading free trade agreements with the Australians, close economic relations, going back to the early 1980s. It might now be the time to actually deepen this and turn this into a proper common economic market. And in a similar way, Australia is our only formal defense ally. There are plenty of people in New Zealand who believe that the UK has a defense alliance with us, but that's not true. And the US, of course, once upon a time we had a defense alliance, and then we foolishly gave that up with our anti-nuclear stance. So Australia is really the only country we can rely on for defense. But we should take this more seriously, and we should really get to a position where we have complete interoperability, to the point where we actually realize that the defense of New Zealand starts with Christmas Island, and that the defense of New Zealand also means that we should be able to put our own crews on Australian submarines, for example. And so that would be the first step. The next step is then to find other democracies and like-minded countries in our region. And for that, I'm looking at South Korea. I'm thinking of Japan. We might actually figure out whether there's something we could do with India. And then, of course, we should also deepen our ties with other democracies in other parts of the world, including the European Union. But it is a world that has become a lot more fractured, a lot more dangerous. And I think what we do see is that those autocracies of this world are cooperating quite closely and quite openly together. And just as they do that to challenge us, we should also then deepen our ties with our friends.
I think you're exactly right. Well, I've got to say, Dr. Hartwich, it has been such a pleasure to speak with you. Where is the best? I'll put links up to so that people can find you afterwards when I publish the edit of our conversation. But for our audience here tonight, where is the best place to go to find more of your material?
You can find everything we've ever published on the Initiative's website. That's nzinitiative.org.nz. There you will find our reports, our newspaper columns, our podcasts, our webinars, YouTube videos. It's all in one place. And if you specifically want to find out what I've said over the years, even from my times before the initiative, so in Sydney and in London, you can find all of that on oliverhartwich.com. And if you've got any further questions on any of this stuff, get in touch, send us an email. You'll find all our contact details on the website.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for the pleasure of your company, Dr. Hartwich. It's been fascinating and enlightening and, in fact, inspiring to speak with you this evening. What I'm going to do, ladies and gentlemen, is I'm going to say good evening to Dr. Hartwich off air and thank him very much on our collective behalf for his thoughts tonight. And I see the moderator PLJ has put up a link to your website in the chat. Guys, I'm going to play you a little bit more music, play you a little bit of cinema, and come back to you in a couple of minutes. This has been Dr. Oliver Hartwich, and you are watching SimonTV.